Hello, everybody. We're going to jump into chapter 14, food distribution. Food is the country's largest industry, and it has been for over 100 years. Makes some sense because you don't have to buy new clothes or a car, but everybody needs to eat. These are the topics we'll be discussing this chapter, and as always, I'll give you the caveat that this PowerPoint narration is just an addendum. You definitely need to read the chapter. This is just a good way to review, to flesh out a couple of the concepts, but I don't cover as much detail as the textbook covers. This is a key graphic from page 347 of the book. It's a simple breakdown of the major distribution pathways. So how food gets from the farm to consumers. This is what we're looking at in this chapter, the different steps in this process, how they work, and how that impacts the food system. It's an aspect of the food system that most customers know only a little bit about, but yet it's highly influential and important. So we're starting at the top of the previous graphic with U.S. farms and raw material suppliers. As discussed in chapter 11, there have been some long-term trends in production where the total number of farms has dropped, and you can look at some of the numbers there from the 50s to the early 21st century, more than cut in half the number of farms. However, the size of those farms has greatly increased, and meanwhile the total number of workers have dropped pretty much similar numbers as the number of establishments, so about in half as well. And what that can tell us is that a very small number of people and relatively small number of farms can feed this entire country and also export a great deal of food. Of course, we also have some food imports, but it's a pretty remarkable amount of production, and that's due to a very efficient production system and all the advances in mechanization. Just to mention here, agricultural production, we're thinking of things that you can eat, but it's not entirely that. There are also fiber products, so things like cotton for clothes, as well as cow leather for car seats and clothes, various industrial products. For instance, some animal fat gets used in various as industrial lubricants, and sometimes bones are ground down to provide minerals for supplements. There are all sorts of little side tangents that are not for food related in agricultural production. So here's where we're going to spend the majority of this chapter, in that in-between place between producers and consumers. So all the assembling and processing, manufacturing of agricultural products for consumers. So this could be something as simple as drying fruits, waxing apples so that they stay fresh longer, making preserves out of fruit, turning wheat and other grains into bakery goods or cereals. That's a huge part of the food industry. Removing the husk always of grains, and sometimes the germ and the bran from grains for refined grains. Husk is always inedible. That's a very outer layer of grains. But the difference between something like brown rice and white rice is that the brown rice has the germ in the bran, the white rice doesn't have the germ in the bran. So that's another example of some food processing, turning sugar beet and sugarcane into sugar, corn into corn syrup, turning some of the less desirable parts of meat products into animal foods, like things that we don't eat a lot in this country, like intestines and brains, often end up in animal food. So here are some more examples of assembling and processing, manufacturing of food. And one way to think about this, if any of you have ever traveled a bit in the developing world, in a lot of food markets in the developing world, the markets are filled with unprocessed food. So you often buy a whole chicken, and it might be a live chicken even. And you don't buy, or you buy pieces of meat, but there aren't necessarily burgers, hot dogs, pre-cut steaks. Everything's more in a um, raw, whole form. Also, people buy a lot of whole grains and legumes like beans, barley, lentils, uh, rice, corn. They just buy it as the whole grain and they cook it and process it at home. Or some people buy milk and make their own yogurt and cheese at home. In many parts of the developing world, you can buy just raw, 10 feet of sugar cane, and you can press the sugar cane at home. But in this country, we buy the vast majority of our food processed. So that's what these intermediaries between producers and consumers are doing. They're preparing the food for easier consumption for the American consumer. Food processing is very much of a modern phenomenon, but there's been some degree of food processing around for tens of thousands of years. Of course, we've gone a much more complex and varied array of food processing processes in the last century than we ever did before, but you can think of early forms of food processing, things like drying fruit, smoking seafood and salting it so it lasts a long time. Actually, just making yogurt and cheese is a form of food processing because you're taking the whole product milk, you're fermenting it, and the cheese will last a whole lot longer than the milk. So the major impetus for these early forms of simple processing was to be able to store food for when there were times when there was less food available. Another common form you might be familiar with is fermenting vegetables. So something like sauerkraut. And most countries that have a cold winter have some sort of fermented vegetable. So that would be a way, let's say in Germany, before refrigeration, they would have big cabbage harvests in the fall. They cut up that cabbage, they add a little salt, and let it sit in glass jars, and it ferments, and they have sauerkraut, which will last the entire winter. So that's a form of simple food processing. I throw a picture of this book called Cod up here, which is a great book about kind of the early seafood industry, specifically around cod in Spain, in up until about the 19th century or so, but for hundreds and hundreds of years, how these sailors went around the world and caught cod and smoked it and salted it and sold it in the markets of Europe. If you're interested in food history, it's a good story, good book. Shows some more examples of food processing, and many of these food processes can be done at home, but nowadays in industrial settings they do this just far more quicker and efficiently and at home. And there are a couple techniques on here which of course no one ever did at home. Things like irradiation, which is exposing foods to a very small amount of radiation that keeps them from spoiling. Extrusion, which is what happens with breakfast cereal, so like Captain Crunch or Cheerios, where you take a mashed up baked grain and put it through a machine that forms it into a specific shape. Modified controlled atmosphere is also a new form of food process, well, relatively new form of food processing. That's when meat is packaged with CO2, which helps it preserve its color and flavor and prevent it from spoiling. And or something like ethylene gas for bananas, where that can speed up the ripening process. Some more terms to know in the marketing channel intermediaries. Food brokers, I think of a little bit like sports agents. So, say for instance, some famous athlete is leaves his current sports team, and he employs a sports agent to take offers from different sports teams and negotiate his new contract. So that's basically what brokers are doing. Food brokers are connecting the producers and the real retailers, or sometimes the wholesalers. So this can happen at big food conventions where the retailers or the merchant wholesalers meet with food brokers. These big retailers and wholesalers, they don't want to deal with single producers, one farmer who produces great strawberries. It's easier to go through a food broker who represents dozens and dozens of producers. And oftentimes these brokers have specific specialties. They work with baked goods, or they work with seafood, or they have their niches. The wholesalers then take ownership of the product, taking it from the producers and delivering it to stores, to retail stores. Some bigger retailers act as their own food service wholesalers. A broker is just the middleman. So the broker doesn't actually ever have physical possession of the product, except for samples, of course. The broker is just the one negotiating the contracts, the buying and the selling. So there are three major classifications of food retailers. We have the traditional grocery stores, and these are the ones that you're all very well familiar with: Safeway, Albertsons, Kroger's, all of those kinds of places. Those used to be about 80% of sales. That's really changed over the years, and a lot of the non-traditional grocery stores have taken the market share, particularly the big super centers. So things like Costco, Sam's Club, Walmart has done incredibly well. These are more like warehouse, almost like wholesale, low-cost facilities, some of which charge annual membership, right? And then the third category, you have convenience stores. So these are the more small stores that have a limited selection of goods. A little more on these food retailers. The food business is always changing. For instance, dollar stores have been getting into selling fruits and vegetables in some areas. They never used to do that. Walmart started in 1962. It did not start selling groceries till 1988, and now is a huge player in groceries. Target didn't sell groceries originally. It was a little bit more like Ross or Marshall's. Now a lot of Targets sell groceries. Wendy's, the fast food place, started selling canned chili. So there's a lot of blurred lines. Grocery stores didn't used to sell hot prepared foods. Over the last couple of decades, they've sold a lot more hot prepared foods. Now you have some restaurants focusing on food deliveries and takeout. That didn't used to be the case several decades ago. And by the way, someone asked me in one of my face-to-face classes, where does Trader Joe's fall? So Trader Joe's would fall under traditional grocery store, but a small grocer. So in addition to the three kinds of common retail stores, the traditional, non-traditional, and convenience stores, there's also something called direct market. So that's that line all the way that goes from the producers directly to the consumers, no middleman. And a couple examples of that are farmers markets, U-Pick, so that's in season. For instance, a big blueberry farm might have a sign on the highway and advertise a couple places that you come out and you pick all you want, and you just pay for the pound, you weigh it on your way out, something like that. And there's my favorite, the CSAs, which is community supported agriculture. And community supported agriculture is when a farm, more of like a 19th century model of a farm, usually has a lot of diversity in the crops, not heavily mechanized, usually has a mixture of fruit, vegetable, and maybe even some animal products, where you buy a share of the farm's harvest. So you might pay, let's say, $500 a year, and then when they are in season producing food, you get a bag or two of whatever is in season and fresh throughout, once a week throughout the entire growing season. Those are really fun. I've been a member of a couple CSAs, really good quality and a pretty reasonable price. Direct markets now are less than 10% of total food sales, but they were way, way lower decades ago, so they've gone much more popular. CSAs, in fact, didn't exist until the late 80s. So it's a little bit of a trend going back to how can we get fresher and more tasty food and still pay a reasonable price. Just to mention, with these direct marketing going from straight producer to the consumers, about half are going to consumers, and actually about half are going to retail food service outlets. So a lot of times it can go to straight to restaurants. So farmers are essentially skipping all the middlemen, all the food brokers, distributors, and going directly to their buyers. So you have a list of some of the advantages and disadvantages of direct marketing, and I'll leave those up for you all to look at, but a couple things to highlight. The flavor and vitamin and nutrient content of these direct from the producers products tends to be quite a bit higher, because both flavor is pretty delicate and a lot of vitamins are pretty delicate, and you lose a bit of both when there's a big time delay between harvest of a food and when it reaches a consumer. U-Picks also get people outdoors with some physical activity, which is really good. And a lot of the CSAs often have potlucks and parties and various community events, so they can really end up building a lot of community around food. You can think a little bit the same way people get really excited about their local microbrewery, right? Of course, a major part of the food distribution system is food service outlets. So that's any business that prepares food outside the home. That compromises about half of total food spending. So, there's some of the obvious things, any kind of restaurant catering service, but also could be like food stands, food trucks, and institutional settings. So, big school cafeterias, hospital cafeterias, military prisons. So a huge part, really, half economically, half of total food spending. Our textbook has several pages on Walmart because Walmart has had such a massive impact on the food system. And I'll cover a few aspects of Walmart here, but for more details, as always, go into the textbook. So Walmart has had made some major innovations in productivity, supply chain management, inventory systems, and they've had a huge impact on U.S. productivity. Competition has really kept food prices low. Walmart moves in and other supermarkets have to lower prices. Of course, sometimes Walmart moves in and some local businesses suffer or go out of business. Walmart has a very well-studied business model because of its vast success. Here is one testament to Walmart's success. You can see it's the biggest employer in large sections of the country. It looks like maybe, a third, a fourth of the country. Walmart's the number one employer. Walmart's critics are numerous, and one of the big criticisms is that it pays very low wages to most of the employees. If you're not a manager or have a good position at Walmart, if you're relatively low on the totem pole there, you're going to make very low wages. And so a lot of the Walmart employees are on food stamps or live in public housing or receiving other forms of government or nonprofit help. So some of the burden of providing a livelihood to those employees shifts to taxpayers and local nonprofits. And of course, also the local clothing shop or local hardware store, grocery, pharmacy, tire shop, all of those generally suffer when Walmart moves in because Walmart is able to offer lower prices. So oftentimes local governments partner with universities to do economic studies to decide whether to allow a Walmart in their community or whether to keep Walmart out of their community. It can make for some very big changes when Walmart enters. You can see the scope of Walmart is absolutely enormous. One out of every $3 spent on groceries in the US goes to Walmart. That's a pretty staggering figure. So Walmart has tremendous influence in what foods are available and how they are produced and what prices farmers receive. And Walmart is so big that it has influence that it can play suppliers against each other. So it is a pretty aggressive business model. Also, it buys at a very huge scale, so smaller businesses generally can't compete. I mean, Walmart's buying literally 1 billion pounds of beef a year. Only the very biggest meat packers in the country can fill that order. So it's a very influential company. So the graphic you're looking at is a pretty famous graphic, and it shifts a little bit year to year, but you see 100 or so popular food brands there, but they're only owned by about 10 big food and beverage manufacturers. So there's been a great deal of consolidation in the food industry over the past few decades. So a little example of this: who owns Haagen-Dazs? Who owns Toll House Cookies? Who owns Tombstone Pizza, and all these various brands? Well, what looks like to be a bunch of maybe small companies, each making a few products, these are actually all owned by Nestle, one of the biggest food companies in the world. And similarly, here's a handful of other well-known brands that are all owned by PepsiCo. And this was a strategy by a lot of these early food companies to get bigger, and that gives them a little bit more power in general in the food market the bigger they get. This process started happening a long time ago, 40s, 50s, 60s, and one of the kind of ripples of countercurrents in the industry in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s was organic and natural processed foods industry. So a lot of these companies like Odwalla and Stonyfield Farms Yogurt, they started out as kind of small family companies, and eventually they were bought out by these big brands who figured it's easier to buy an established company than necessarily go in and compete with them in this growing field of organic natural foods. I always tell my students, and sometimes my patients too, when I was working clinically, if it bothers you that we have such a kind of corporate food system, you can make a little bit of a difference. You can do the dollar vote, your civic power. You can vote with your spatula. And in a way, cooking is voting. And you can think of just buying your own ingredients and making your own food, and you might be able to dodge a lot of these more processed food choices that are also contributing to a more industrialized system that's owned only by a handful of big food players. Another trend in the food system is getting more and more food from overseas, and oftentimes these big food distributors. They'll be able to secure contracts in countries like Guatemala, Honduras, for large farms producing a lot of our fruits and vegetables. Also in Mexico for sure, for the U.S. Uh, Very low labor costs, very cheap land, and then they're able to import those products into the U.S. and make a pretty good profit. And it's a bit of a concern in some of these developing countries, since some of these places have uh, their own issues with food security and being able to feed their own citizens um, healthy foods at relatively low cost. But since they're outcompeted by the foreign dollar, sometimes the best foods, for instance, for the U.S. market, come from Latin America, and then we're shipping back to Latin America a lot of processed food. So the U.S. is very much winning out on this, but it's coming at a bit of a global cost. The roots of this really start with the banana industry, banana and coffee as well. They revolutionized kind of international food trade and developed a lot of these relationships. And if you're interested in these topics, two great books I can recommend: Coffee Land, the Banana, which I put the images on there, and entertaining and also informative. I've mentioned quite a few of the benefits, as well as quite a few of the drawbacks of the modern industrial food system. And there are a lot of people and organizations, nonprofits, sometimes state and local governments, that are working on some of the more negative aspects of the modern food system. And I thought I'd just highlight one. This is run by Oxfam, which is a very old, well-established nonprofit. And this is the Behind the Brands campaign, which is working to hold accountable the top 10 food companies in the world for their company policies as it pertains to fair economics, human rights, climate change, and gender equality. Worth looking up if you're interested in this topic more. So just to summarize a couple of the system trends we've looked at in this chapter, there's been a lot of consolidation. Since 1972, the top 50 food processors had 39% of sales. In the 21st century, it's over 50%. Those food companies are accountable to shareholders, not the public, so there's always this kind of tension between profit versus health, nutrition, sustainability. Sometimes those can all align, but oftentimes the health and wellness can contradict profits. And we are spending less on food as a percent of our disposable income. That's been going down for a century, although in recent years that trend has kind of slowed and reversed slightly, but still in the bigger picture a lot less on food than it was 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. And we eat a lot more food away from the home, a lot more food service, and some what I see as pretty positive developments. Things like community support agriculture and farmers markets have been growing rapidly in recent decades. And of course, as mentioned earlier, the consolidation is on all ends. So the consolidation of small farms into bigger farms, smaller retailers into bigger retailers, and that's been going on for quite a while. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this chapter, and I'll be back at you with another one soon.